All right. Well, welcome back to our second edition of Prosthodontic Lit Review. It's kind of funny, Jones and I were talking about this, and we love literature and going over it, but in residency, it seemed like a big chore. But for whatever reason now in private practice, I miss that. It's fun. That's one huge advantage of working with someone amazing like Dr. Jones, because we get to read articles and debate them all the time. And that's why we thought it'd be fun to do this with everybody. So what we're going to do every day, or as many times as we can, is pick an article that we think's relevant to what we're doing and share it. Today, in the Journal of Prosthodontics, in this month's journal, we saw this title, which we thought was interesting: Digital versus Conventional Full Arch Implant Impressions, a Prospective Study on 16 Edentulous Maxillae. The reason we like this, we do a lot of full arch implant prosthetics. We're always looking for a more efficient, more productive, more accurate way to do this. We also have a Trios 4 and a Trios 2 in our office, and we try to utilize that as much as we can. It's been a huge aid and assistant to us. We also have a full service lab with digital technology and software in there. We use exocad. We have a Medit benchtop scanner. There's a lot of things that we have, so we're always looking to see how can we utilize that, because potentially the better digital gets, the more efficient we can be, we feel. And so that's why we chose this one to go over. Hopefully as we go through this, we'll show you what we look at, where there's biases or concerns, or how maybe it doesn't relate to what we're doing, or it does. But in the end, it's a great study, and it gets us down the right track of learning better what this technology can do for our office.
So, like Dr. Gurney said, when we start looking at an article, we start to look at biases, and that's typically shown on the left-hand column right at the beginning, and talking about financial support. And why that's important is sometimes if they're going to be talking about a material and saying that the material is great, yet everything is financed by them, you start asking yourself, how accurate is that information? It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the study, but it's something that you should pay attention to. And so here, the main sponsor is Straumann, and they're sponsoring this. The other thing to look at too is where the study was done. In this case, this was done in a grad pros. And in most residencies, I think there's going to be, not always, but I would typically say there's limited biases. They do their best to unbias anything. It's part of our training. Overall, I didn't see anything where I'm really concerned from a bias standpoint. So what's the whole purpose? Let's kind of take a look at everything generally. The title kind of talks about that a little bit. Is we want to compare the differences between a traditional impression versus a digital impression, and looking at the accuracies. How accurate are those relate to one another? So looking at the materials and methods, they had 16 patients, and they began by making a traditional full arch impression using a verification jig and pouring up those casts in appropriate stone. And then also doing the same thing, but doing it digitally. And so putting scan bodies on. They also used some fiduciary markers to help correlate. And then they took the actual analog cast and scanned those in with the lab scanner. And then they related those two and seen how accurate things were. As you would imagine, overall, there were some discrepancies. And the more implants they scanned, the more inaccurate it got. And we get into that later. All in all, their overall conclusion was that it may be clinically feasible to do a digital impression for a full arch implant prosthetic such as these here. There are some caveats to that. One of the limitations is going to be that this is only for the maxilla, right? And so if you have a patient that's got a mandible as well that needs it, I guess you can do it digitally. Sometimes it's easier from a workflow standpoint to do things the same way on both arches. But that's the overall gist of the study, and we'll go ahead and get into it now.
Okay, so one of the things I think is really important when we look at an article, and Jones just did this, he went and looked at the overview, like the abstract, right? Well, is this something that will be relevant to what we're doing? And that's why we went through the abstract. I'm like, okay, looks like it's something that'd be relevant to what we are doing, which we described already. Then I think it's important to go look at the methodology and see, if it's really something that's practical that we do that might be applicable to what we do in our office, or are they doing things that just aren't realistic, or using techniques and methods that just aren't really going to work in our office.
Which you see a lot.
Which you do see a lot. So let's just look at what they did. And again, the whole purpose here is just to see how practical this is for what we do. Now, they took only edentulous patients, so they made sure every patient was completely edentulous for at least 1 year. So does that make sense? Like, they didn't have any teeth, they wore a denture for a while, and then they went back and planned where the implants would go. They also said none of these patients required any sort of grafting to be able to do the implants. That's just important to know. I mean, that may or may not affect the success of the implants or what we would do in our office, but that's just important to know that that's the type of patient they're working with. So in reality, that's like a perfect clean bed of potentially health, bone, just a great simple way to do some implants. Very easy way to plan the implants. In a PROS program, usually when they're in an edentulous state, you can design the teeth wherever you want. You merge that in with your CT scan. You retro plan from there where the implants go, which I think is what they described they did. Did you see anything else there?
No.
Okay. Then this is where we thought there might be a bias, but the reality is I don't really think there is. There's financial support through Straumann, and they use Straumann implants. They're all BLT rock solid implants. Some patients got 4, some patients got 5, and some patients got 6. Again, they're only reporting what happened in the maxilla, which ultimately maybe in the future there was patients that were edentulous. Oh, that's one thing I didn't say. There were patients that were edentulous in the maxilla and mandible, so I think I said that wrong. There are patients that were edentulous in the maxilla and partially dentate in the mandible and completely dentate in the mandible. I think it says that later on somewhere. It didn't really say it too well up in their methods, did it?
Yeah, a little bit.
So that's just important too, which can also play a role in success and failure, and also your complications with prosthetics, depending on what the opposing dentition is. That's important things to look at when they start categorizing what in any study where they talk about complication rate. This one, they're not going over that. But they do have another article that we'd love to go over at some point. It's a follow-up to this one that talks about complications. Anyways, what are we doing here? So they immediately loaded these prosthetics as well. So they put the implants in. They converted a denture into a healing fixed prosthetic. They waited 2 months till those implants had healed, and then they started making their final prosthetics. And during that final fabrication process is what Jones overviewed in the abstract. They went through the traditional methodology of using a polyvinyl siloxane impression. They verified those casts using a verification jig. I didn't see, did they make an impression over that verification jig?
No, I think they just used it to verify.
Just to verify.
Intro early, yeah.
Okay. So then they verified that. On the same time, they went ahead and put these fiduciary markers on and these scan bodies. These are CARES scan bodies, so it's Straumann's brand of intraoral scan body, which is another whole different discussion about whatever scan body you use will dictate what you can use in the lab, and you have to have your libraries appropriate for that. Okay, so when they did that, what I was kind of disappointed in the article a little bit is when we start talking about these fiduciary markers, they don't describe that anywhere in their methodology of where they got them, what they are, how they use them. Usually, just in general, fiduciary markers are locations that you can click on in software to help correlate and align. So I know that's what they probably use them for, but again, we don't have where they got them, how they put them on. It looks like there's a little, can't really see that in here, but on a different image, I believe it looks like there's a little circle, like a sticky circle, that helps them stay in there. Okay, this was kind of interesting, at least for me. they torqued all the scan bodies and impression copings down to 15 Newton centimeters. I don't know if everybody always does that, but they probably did that to be consistent on everything they did. My worry is on these CARES scan bodies, they're completely plastic or PEEK material. So my worry is the more you torque those down, the greater chance you may start to exhibit distortion in that connection. So I don't personally know the literature on that of how many times you torque something down that it'll affect the seating of that. We just had the experience that when our staff or our lab or even us in the lab using that material and torquing it down, they can get distorted.
Yeah, we've had that
pretty quickly. So they did quite a few arches with these scan bodies. They probably reused. They didn't say if they reused them or if Straumann was able to give them new ones for each patient, which may also affect that. There's studies that show the reuse of a scan body can be accurate. Reuse of an impression coping can be accurate up to somewhere 12, 15 times. But they didn't really talk about that too much in here. But those are things that, to me, may play a factor in what we're looking at and doing. Anything that you saw on that methodology? But the reality is those are things that we deal with every day. Then the other thing I'd point out is they used it, and they talk about this later in their discussion, but they used a true definition 3M intraoral scanner. You can see here it uses powder. Again, they didn't put that in their methodology. They probably just assumed that was well known or common sense that you have to spray the intraoral cavity with this powder to make that even possible with the TrueDef. They also used, once they got their final models, they used, where is that?
It goes on later.
They used a Dental Wings benchtop scanner, I think. Yep, Dental Wings 7 scanner. Which, again, you'd have to understand the literature really well to know, what the discrepancies of a 3M scanner, TrueDef scanner are in the mouth, and what the Dental Wings Series 7 scanner inaccuracies are when comparing apples to apples. So that would be they talk about this in their discussion, but that would be a huge component of understanding how these results really apply to what we're doing in our offices. Like in our case, we use a Trios 4, and we have a Medit, was it 500?
Yeah.
Lap benchtop scanner, which are both newer versions of even these. Like I think even these scanners may have newer versions out. But that's just important to know and understand as we start to analyze what this data means. Let's see, anything else there? Yep. So then they talk about taking that master model, this model here from the analog, and then they use the same scan bodies. These are intraoral, but you can use them desktop. And they use the same scan bodies. Did they say they did the same ones they used intraorally?
I don't know if they said that they did.
That'd be interesting too.
If it's the same one for the same patient,
right,
or if they're totally new ones.
I mean, that would probably make the study even more accurate if they use the ones in the mouth and then use the same ones in the lab for the same patient.
Yeah.
I doubt they did that, but that would be probably a good thing to do, just to minimize any discrepancy. And using the same...
Or just using new ones.
Every time?
Using new ones every time would probably be the best. But, I mean, really, there's not a whole lot of arches if they're doing it here, so... Right. Probably minimal, if any, discrepancies.
But if they were torquing all these to 15...
Yeah, it's possible.
So they go the mouth 15, then they put these on the model 15, then they go to the next patient 15, 15, 15.
Right.
Like, that's probably likely... How many patients they have?
16 or 15.
16? That's probably... Even those studies that show... 12 to 15 times,
right,
they're probably losing some accuracy in that. So it'd be interesting to see that data as well. Anyways, things there that may be different is if they would have used the same ones, same location, patient and the lab. What they did though is they have this model and they scan that in with, again, the Dental Wings, and then they have the digital model, which you see here, with the trio, or not the trios, but the 3M, and then they correlated these with, what did they correlate with? A geo, right here? Idaho Magic Control X 3D system from Rock Hill, South Carolina. And so what they do is they try to superimpose those, and they have a definition or a number that tells how well they're correlated. Now, I have to be completely honest, I don't know much about that number.
Yeah.
Jones and I were talking about that this morning before we got on here and did that. What do they call that?
Oh, the correlation coefficient?
Is that what it is? The correlation, right here, what's it called? Spearman correlation. So that's what it's called, right? The correlation between, no, that's a statistic. What do they call it? This number. Oh, I don't remember, but it ends up giving you this number. You see these numbers in the hundreds? That's the part that we don't understand. What does that number really mean? The bigger or smaller? Based on what their results and discussion are, the bigger the number, the less the correlation,
Yeah.
right? They do reference about 15 studies, and they make a reference of this of being mostly benchtop studies. And there's a range that we've deemed in, I guess, this field of study to be clinically acceptable of, what did they say? That's probably down in the discussion. Up to 200 microns. Full arch digital impression scan lies within previously reported clinical acceptance thresholds of up to 200 microns. So they feel, Jones will probably talk about this more in a second, but they feel these numbers are within clinical okayness or relevance. So that's basically their methodology. Again, I'm not a super good statistician. That was my hardest part of my residency, especially during my own master's thesis.
That's why I had a statistician.
We had a statistician.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm like, what the heck are you doing? Some of my classmates were just incredibly smarter than I was, and they got it. But so I'm not going to go in, honestly, to the statistics because I'll mess you up. But that's the basics of how they did their methodology. And I'll let Jones go into the results and discussion.
So the results are pretty straightforward. We talked about this a little bit during the initial discussion, and it's really that the discrepancy increased with the more implants. So when having only 4 implants,
which seems odd to me. Like when I read that, like if you have more correlating
might
markers,
be easier. I think the challenge is with the intraoral scanners is the further away you get from one spot to another.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If there was less, that's a further space, so you'd think that would be less accurate. So I don't know, that was weird to me, but it is what it is.
Yeah. So with the 4 implants, 139 micron discrepancy, and with the 6 implants, you've got 185 micron discrepancy, and there's quite a bit of variation here too, plus or minus 81 microns,
and even more in the middle group.
Yep. And so you're potentially busting that what they say clinically acceptable 200 microns. Where those
can I add one more thing about the methodology I just thought about is your scan technique plays a big part in how you do things, and they don't go into how they scanned that jaw either. Yeah. And we just know scanning can be difficult, and
there's a technique,
right,
and a process to it to make it accurate.
They did say they had basically the pros student doing most of this, which can also put in some biases there, because when you're a pros resident, you're learning how to do stuff. So I'm sure they went through everything and correlated and knew what they were doing, but they don't talk about the scanning technique, the pattern and process.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with this specifically this study, but those are kind of the things that you have to look at, because sometimes you read something and the methodology just isn't very good, and so the results don't necessarily
fully correlate.
Yeah, exactly. So some other things that we notice here is the power analysis. They said is only 51%, which basically just means that because there's such a low amount, the N was only 16, that you can't draw these huge relationships and generally say that this is good for everything. This is kind of like I don't want to, I'd call it a pilot study, but certainly you would need a lot more arches to look at this to have a more powerful number. But there wasn't any statistically significant difference between doing a scan body, with a cast, or doing intraoral scanning. I was going to say something else. I don't remember what it was. So, the 200. So 200 microns just seems like a lot, and so I went and I kind of just briefly looked at the studies that they quoted, which was, anytime they're giving
32.
stats, right? So 31 and 32, and then we can come down here and see. And, these are studies that were done back when I was graduating high school. So these are older studies. It'd be interested to see if there's something newer. Maybe that's just what they, in those times, that's what was appropriate. Again, one of those things where they're quoting something, but is that good information? And it probably is. It's probably just standard. But it's nice to know where that information comes from. Want to get into the discussion?
Go for it.
So, really, there's not much to go over. I don't want to rehash things that we already talked about, but I'll go over some things that we had highlighted here. States that, their overall goal was that they want to assess if the threshold for clinical acceptability, the study here relies within that. And ultimately, they decided that, what they were able to come up with and discrepancies did fall in lines with this 59 to 200 micron difference. And so their conclusions state that full arch digital scans and a complete digital workflow in the fabrication of maxillary fixed complete dentures may be clinically feasible.
Right.
So you can do it one way or the other and still get acceptable results according to this 59 to 200 micron difference. Just know that if you are going to do it digitally, there may be a slightly more discrepancies, but according to this study, not clinically relevant.
Right. And then I'll point out here again, which we talked about earlier. Jones talked about the sample size, which doesn't make it that strong of a study. And then again, the different types or methodology or
the materials.
Technology.
Yeah.
The technology, there could be better technology out there than the true definition and the dental wings. And how does that correlate? Cool thing, really, like Jones is saying, is I just can't wait till we can scan somebody without doing all the other steps. Like what we do normally is we'll make an impression, open tray impression of the implants, or if they're in a prosthetic, like an immediate load prosthetic that goes on all those implants, we'll make a base of that, so attach analogs, pour up a little stone putty or patty, and let it set up, and then we'll make a verification jig on that, section it, go to the mouth, lute it together, and make a final impression with the verification within the impression, which, as far as I understand the literature, that's the most accurate way to make a cast. And then we'll go from there and scan it in. So that's 2 visits per se, depending on how you do that. And if we can do something like this, where you have these fiduciary markers and the intraoral scan bodies, that's 1 visit.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome. Mandible presents its own difficulties because of the tissue. But that's what we really liked it. I think it's awesome. People are trying to figure out if it works or not. I think how it applies to us clinically, these discrepancies here will ultimately depend on what materials we use. If we use a titanium or a cast metal and we see a misfit from that, we can section those ultimately and get them put back together. If we're using a zirconia framework, and the misfit is significant here, that's not a really good situation that we're super excited about. Because we've seen zirconia chip, or not chip, but break, or even where the connections is strained, there's a little tie base that goes up into that zirconia, and depending on that thickness there, we've seen that part break, or we've seen the prosthetic itself just break in half.
And some debonding of the tie base from the prosthetic itself.
So especially when you're using the materials we have today, I think that clinical misfit is super important to get just right to minimize that. Otherwise, you'll see a lot more complications. Like I mentioned earlier, I think I was wrong. I was thinking about what I said. Is they have a follow-up article of this. It's not related to whatever I was saying. It is the technique of doing a digital full arch prosthetic with this scanning technique.
Is it the same group?
Same group, yeah.
Okay.
And that's it. Usually when these guys do studies, they find a way to do a couple articles. So you probably will see at some point a mandibular study as well. If they try to do the same thing with the mandible, whether it's accurate or not, they'll probably, hopefully, share it. If you guys have any questions about the lit review or any suggestions on different things to review, that'd be great. For Jones and I personally, it's just for fun for us to do. Like, it's one of our goals to keep on top of things, and if we debate it even in this format and it helps someone else, that's great. So thank you. Do you have anything else?
Nope, that's it. See you
All
next
right.
time.
See you next time.